The mysterious disappearance of Susan Mauldin. The apartment felt cold. It had been hours since Susan left. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence. Every second dragged on, as if time itself was reluctant to pass. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. It seemed to echo her unease. She had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where she went. No phone calls. No messages. Just gone. Her parents had gone to the police. But there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. Nothing that could explain it. The officers combed through her apartment. They found nothing unusual at first. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Her shoes were still by the door. Her bag, resting on the kitchen counter. Everything seemed normal. But the walls. There was something unsettling about the walls. The small cracks. The way the paint peeled in certain places. A constant reminder that something wasn't right. Then they found it. A single strand of hair on the floor. It wasn't Susan's. The police couldn't figure out who it belonged to. It felt wrong. Like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Weeks went by. The search continued. Still, there was no sign of her. And then they found the tapes. Hidden under the floorboards in her bedroom. Footage. Dark, grainy footage. It wasn't like anything they'd expected. The first video was a close-up of Susan's face. She looked terrified. Her eyes wide, her mouth moving silently. The camera jerked, as if someone was holding it too tightly. In the background, there was a shadow. A figure. It was difficult to make out, but it was there. Lurking. The footage continued, showing Susan moving frantically. She was running, but where? The final tape was the most disturbing. Susan alone. Huddled in the corner of her apartment. Her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She was shaking. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, the figure. It was right behind her. Too close. The tape cut abruptly. And that was the last time anyone heard from Susan Mauldin. Her disappearance remains unsolved. It felt rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself she was safe. The man didn't stay long. But he had seen enough. He had noticed something in the man's hand. A small, black object. A camera. The same camera from the tapes. The man had been filming Susan long before that final video. The man spoke again, his voice shaking.
He never told anyone, he said.
He didn't want to get involved. But after seeing what had happened to Susan, he couldn't stay silent anymore. The police rushed to the building next door. They searched every corner, every room. It was empty. Nothing. No trace of the man. No sign of the camera. And yet, they knew one thing. The figure was real. And they were closer to the truth than ever before. But Susan? She was still missing. And as the case grew colder, something else became clear. The man wasn't just a shadow in her life. He had been in the walls the entire time. Waiting. Watching. The unsettling feeling lingered long after the case went cold. The tapes, the photographs, the whispered rumors, they all led to the same question. Who was the man in the shadows? And was Susan still out there? Months passed, but the questions lingered. The case was slowly fading from the headlines. The urgency of Susan's disappearance dulled with time. But some things couldn't be forgotten. The image of that shadowed figure. The eerie silence in Susan's apartment. The whispers in the walls. Detective Carter, still haunted by the case, couldn't let go. There was something about the man, the figure. He couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, Carter decided to go back. To Susan's apartment. Not for answers. But for something deeper. Maybe, just maybe, he could feel it, sense the weight of what was missing. He stood outside the building looking up at the windows. The same cold breeze brushed past him. The place seemed abandoned, even though people lived there. Carter's footsteps echoed as he walked up the stairs. He reached the door. It had been locked, sealed by police months ago. But now, there was no sign of the investigation team. No caution tape. No guards. Just silence. With a feeling of unease, Carter twisted the knob. The door creaked open. The apartment felt exactly as it had when they left it. The same quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The same cold air that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The same faint smell of coffee. Nothing had changed. But then, Carter saw it. The small crack in the wall. He hadn't noticed it before. It was near the corner by the window, hidden by a heavy curtain. Something inside the crack was glowing. A soft, faint light. He approached it carefully. The glow was coming from behind the plaster. His heart began to race. What was this? He pulled at the crack, gently at first, then harder. Piece by piece, the plaster fell away. And there it was. A small, hidden compartment. Inside, staring back at him, was an old, dusty camera. The same camera from the tapes. It was tucked away in the wall, as if it had always been there. Carter's hands trembled as he picked it up. The lens was cracked, but the footage inside? It was still intact. He plugged the camera into his portable device and hit play. The screen flickered. At first, just static. Then, the grainy image appeared. It was Susan. But she was different now. Hollow eyes. Pale skin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she was being controlled. She was standing in front of a mirror, staring at herself. The room around her was dimly lit, but the shadow, the figure, was there, just behind her. This time, though, there was no mistaking it. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man, but not just any man. It was the landlord of the building. The man who had lived next door. The man who had been watching. His face, cold and expressionless, stared back at Susan as she trembled. He wasn't just watching now. He was speaking to her. But the tapes. They don't lie. They never do. The tapes sat in the evidence room, untouched for days. The investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. There was a connection, they just couldn't pinpoint it. Then, a breakthrough. A man walked into the station. He was unremarkable at first glance. Thin, scruffy hair.
Pale skin.
A nervous smile. He handed over a small envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a dark alley. A figure stood in the shadows, obscured by a hood. A faint outline of a woman could be seen further down the alley. The man, shaking, told them he recognized the figure. It was the same person he'd seen with Susan, months before she disappeared. He had been watching. Not in the usual way, though.
No.
He had been living in the building next door. The one with the broken elevator. He'd heard things. Small sounds, whispers in the walls. He had watched her for weeks. Sometimes from the window, other times from the hallway. But one night he saw her talking to someone.
A man.
Not just any man. The same figure from the tapes. The man in the shadows. He couldn't explain it, but something about the way they interacted unsettled him. It wasn't like any normal conversation. There was an intensity to it. A coldness. Something about the way Susan looked at him, it was wrong. It felt rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself she was safe. The man didn't stay long. But he had seen enough. He had noticed something in the man's hand. A small, black object. A camera. The same camera from the tapes. The man had been filming Susan long before that final video. The man spoke again, his voice shaking.
He never told anyone, he said. He didn't want to get involved.
But after seeing what had happened to Susan, he couldn't stay silent anymore. The police rushed to the building next door. They searched every corner, every room. It was empty. Nothing. No trace of the man. No sign of the camera. And yet they knew one thing. The figure was real. And they were closer to the truth than ever before.
But Susan?
She was still missing. And as the case grew colder, something else became clear. The man wasn't just a shadow in her life. He had been in the walls the entire time. Waiting. Watching. The unsettling feeling lingered long after the case went cold. The tapes, the photographs, the whispered rumors, they all led to the same question. Who was the man in the shadows? And was Susan still out there? Months passed, but the questions lingered. The case was slowly fading from the headlines. The urgency of Susan's disappearance dulled with time. But some things couldn't be forgotten. The image of that shadowed figure. The eerie silence in Susan's apartment. The whispers in the walls. Detective Carter, still haunted by the case, couldn't let go. There was something about the man, the figure. He couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, Carter decided to go back to Susan's apartment. Not for answers, but for something deeper. Maybe, just maybe, he could feel it, sense the weight of what was missing. He stood outside the building, looking up at the windows. The same cold breeze brushed past him. The place seemed abandoned, even though people lived there. Carter's footsteps echoed as he walked up the stairs. He reached the door. It had been locked, sealed by police months ago. But now, there was no sign of the investigation team. No caution tape. No guards. Just silence. With a feeling of unease, Carter twisted the knob. The door creaked open. The apartment felt exactly as it had when they left it. The same quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The same cold air that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The same faint smell of coffee. Nothing had changed. But then, Carter saw it. The small crack in the wall. He hadn't noticed it before. It was near the corner by the window, hidden by a heavy curtain. Something inside the crack was glowing. A soft, faint light. He approached it carefully. The glow was coming from behind the plaster. His heart began to race. What was this? He pulled at the crack, gently at first, then harder. Piece by piece, the plaster fell away. And there it was. A small, hidden compartment. Inside, staring back at him, was an old, dusty camera. The same camera from the tapes. It was tucked away in the wall, as if it had always been there. Carter's hands trembled as he picked it up. The lens was cracked, but the footage inside? It was still intact. He plugged the camera into his portable device and hit play. The screen flickered. At first, just static. Then, the grainy image appeared. It was Susan. But she was different now. Hollow eyes. Pale skin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she was being controlled. She was standing in front of a mirror, staring at herself. The room around her was dimly lit, but the shadow, the figure, was there, just behind her. This time, though, there was no mistaking it. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man, but not just any man. It was the landlord of the building. The man who had lived next door. The man who had been watching. His face, cold and expressionless, stared back at Susan as she trembled. He wasn't just watching now. He was speaking to her. And for the first time, Carter heard it. The faint whisper of the voice. It was low, unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a command. Susan's eyes glazed over. Her body stiffened. And then she began to speak. Words that didn't make sense. Words that were never her own. The camera shut off suddenly, the last image frozen on her face. It wasn't fear that he saw anymore. It was something far worse. It was submission. Carter couldn't breathe. His chest tightened. He looked back at the dark apartment, the walls now feeling like they were closing in. What had happened to Susan? Where had she gone? And more importantly, who had taken her? In that moment, Carter realized something. The man in the shadows hadn't just been watching. He had been controlling, pulling the strings. And Susan was never meant to escape. Not from him. Not from the darkness that had been growing inside the walls all along. The case wasn't closed. It was only beginning. And Carter wasn't sure if he was ready to uncover the truth. Carter sat still in the cold, dark apartment, staring at the screen. The images of Susan, her vacant eyes and hollow voice, replayed in his mind. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was something far darker. He looked at the camera in his hands again, almost afraid to touch it. The lens was cracked, but the footage was clear enough. The words Susan had spoken, they were still haunting him. They weren't her words. They didn't belong to her. The sound of her voice had changed, too. It wasn't human anymore. And the man, the landlord. Why him? Carter slowly rose from the chair, his legs unsteady. The apartment felt colder than it had before. It was as if the walls were breathing. He turned to leave, but stopped. Something caught his eye. A small notebook was resting on the table near the window. It hadn't been there earlier. It was leather-bound, old, worn. Carter reached for it, feeling a chill run down his spine. The pages inside were filled with neat handwriting. The handwriting was unfamiliar. It was a journal. Susan's journal. Carter's pulse quickened as he flipped through the pages. At first, they were normal. But as he went further, the entries grew darker. More frantic. One entry, written in bold, frantic script, stood out. Asterisk, he's watching me. I can feel him. Every moment, every breath. The walls are alive. They speak to me. He watches me from inside them. I can't escape. He won't let me. Asterisk. Another entry, dated only a week before she vanished. Asterisk, I tried to leave. I can't anymore. He's everywhere. He controls everything. The building, the walls, the very air. And now he has my voice. He has my soul. Asterisk. The pages grew even more erratic as Carter read. One final entry. Asterisk, it's too late for me. He's taking me. But not just me. He'll take everyone. He's not done yet. The walls are hungry. Asterisk. Carter's hands shook as he closed the journal. His mind raced. The walls were alive. He had heard rumors about the building, waiting in the walls. Carter's breath quickened. He had been so close to the truth, but now he could feel it. The darkness was deeper than he could imagine. Rumors of strange happenings, of people vanishing without a trace. But this was different. This wasn't just about Susan anymore. It wasn't just about a missing woman or a dangerous man. It was about something ancient. Something that had been waiting in the walls. Carter's breath quickened. He had been so close to the truth, but now he could feel it. The darkness was deeper than he could imagine. And it wasn't just Susan it had claimed. It was anyone who dared to get too close. He had to find answers. But every step closer to the truth felt like a step deeper into the void. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A new message. It was from an unknown number. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Before he could react, another message appeared. Asterisk, the walls are listening. You're already inside. Don't try to leave. Asterisk. Carter turned to the door, his heart pounding. He could hear something now. A low hum. A vibration in the walls. It was as if they were alive, breathing, watching. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. There was something else, something even more unsettling. The apartment was no longer empty. He wasn't alone. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Slowly, deliberately. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the same cold, empty air. And then the whispers. Low, soft, faint. Coming from the walls. They were everywhere. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The whispering grew louder. Closer. It wasn't just the walls. It was them. Susan. The landlord. And the others. The ones who had been swallowed by the building. They were all there in the walls. And now, they were coming for him. Carter's pulse raced. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He reached for his phone, trying to call for help. But the screen went black. No signal. The whispers turned into a chant. A song. And then, a face appeared in the darkness. The same hollow, dead eyes that had been watching Susan. It was the landlord. But it wasn't him anymore. Not entirely. The figure stepped forward, and Carter froze. There was no escape. The walls had claimed him too. And as the room spun into darkness, Carter realized with cold certainty. The building was alive. And now it was hungry for more. Carter's heart raced, his chest tightening as the shadow drew closer. The figure moved silently, gliding across the room with unnatural grace. He wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The air felt thick, suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. The whispers grew louder, the chant more urgent. It was a voice, a chorus of voices, echoing from every corner, every crack in the wall. He could barely make out the words. We are waiting for you." Carter's eyes darted around the apartment, desperate for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The windows were sealed tight. And the figure, the landlord, was closer now, his face twisted in an expression that was both familiar and horribly alien.
It was him, but it wasn't.
The eyes were empty, voids where life once existed, and the smile was stretched wide, unnatural. The walls behind him seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing, hungry. Carter stumbled backward, his legs finally responding, but it was too late. The figure reached out, his fingers stretching unnaturally long, like claws. A sharp, cold pressure gripped Carter's arm, pulling him toward the center of the room. He fought it, but the grip was iron. The figure's face loomed closer, the smile widening, as if savoring the moment. And then, in a voice that sent chills crawling up Carter's spine, it spoke. Asterisk, you should have left when you had the chance. Asterisk. The words were cold, ancient, like they came from deep within the walls themselves. The shadow seemed to ripple, distorting, shifting, as if it was made of smoke or darkness itself. Carter's mind raced. The journal, the tapes, the whispers, asterisk, they were all connected, asterisk. Susan wasn't the only one trapped here.
No.
The landlord had been part of this. And so had the others, the ones whose names were lost to time. This building, this place, it wasn't just a home.
It was a prison.
A prison with no walls. No boundaries. The land itself was alive.
It was feeding on them.
It fed on those who dared to enter, those who looked too deep. It had claimed Susan. It had claimed the landlord. And now it was claiming Carter. The pressure on his arm increased, pulling him closer to the center of the room, where the floor seemed to crack open. A black void, pulsing with a malevolent energy, yawned beneath him. He could feel it. Asterisk something asterisk calling from below. It wasn't the building. It wasn't the landlord. It was something far older, something far more dangerous. Something that had been trapped beneath the earth, beneath the foundation for centuries. It was reaching for him now. The figure, no longer just the landlord, smiled again, the grotesque expression stretching wider, as if it could no longer contain its hunger. Asterisk, you're mine now. Asterisk. In that moment, Carter realized the full truth. The building had never been just a structure. It had been a gate for something dark, something ancient, something alive. And those who were trapped within, like Susan, like the landlord, like the others, had become part of it. Part of its hunger. Carter's mind spiraled into chaos as he was dragged closer to the dark abyss. He tried to scream, to fight back, but it was futile. The walls pressed in on him, his vision blurring. The figure loomed above him now, its smile widening, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. He could feel the pull. The darkness was swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the camera. The same camera from the tapes. It was still running, still recording. And as Carter's vision faded to black, he heard one final whisper. Asterisk, you are the next story. Asterisk. The screen flickered. And then, the room fell silent. The apartment was once again empty, except for the soft hum of the walls, still alive, still waiting for the next one. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if the very air had been drained of life. For hours, maybe days, the building stood still, its windows dark and unyielding. No one came. No one left. And yet, something was watching. The walls hummed, low, insistent. A vibration that seemed to pulse with something ancient, something alive. The room was still, but not empty. The camera, still running, still recording, was the only witness to what had happened. The last traces of Carter were now gone, swallowed into the same darkness that had claimed Susan, the landlord, and everyone else who had vanished. But even in the stillness, something changed. The tape, the footage was still there. And when the camera stopped recording, it was as if a new cycle began. A new story. A new victim. The next morning, the building's tenants woke, oblivious to the horror that had unfolded the night before. They moved about their lives in an eerie calm, as though nothing had ever happened. The doors opened, the elevators hummed to life. The sounds of a normal day filled the halls. But beneath the surface, the apartment was different. The whispers were louder now. The walls more restless. And there, hidden beneath the floorboards, where it had always been, the camera, waiting, recording. The tape was full again. And the new face staring back from the screen was someone familiar. It was one of the tenants who lived in the building. A young woman. She was laughing as she moved through the hallways, completely unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the corners of her vision. The figure had already found her. It always found them. The walls had claimed Carter. They had claimed Susan. And now they would claim her. The figure, masked in shadows, moved behind her. Quiet, silent, unseen. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, the woman's face was no longer her own. It was twisted, pale, and hollow. Her eyes were wide, staring, vacant like Susan's. She was already one of them. The camera clicked, the tape rolled, and the building waited. The walls were listening. And the hunger? It never stopped. It would never stop. It was always waiting for the next one, the next story, and the next victim. Just like it had been waiting for Carter. For Susan. For everyone before them. The building was alive. And it was never finished. It would never be finished. As long as there were those foolish enough to come, to stay, to belong, the hunger would never cease. And the walls? They would always be listening. Days passed, and the building seemed as normal as ever. People came and went. The hum of the city outside barely penetrated the thick, oppressive silence of the apartment complex. The halls felt colder now, though. A chill that lingered longer than it should. And in the shadows things moved. Things that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. A faint rustling. A whisper carried through the walls. A faint tap-tap-tap that echoed through the rooms in the dead of night. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But for those who listened carefully enough, they could hear it, the growing sound of something hungry. Waiting. It was hard to explain. Like the building itself had become a living thing, with its own pulse, its own rhythm. And if you paid attention, if you dared to listen for too long, you could feel the floorboards shift beneath your feet. There was always something just behind you. Someone just watching. The tenants were starting to notice the change, but they couldn't place it. They couldn't explain why they felt the constant pull in their chests, as if something was drawing them to the center of the building. Some of them tried to leave. But the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't budge. There was no way out. No escape. And then, just as before, the new tenant arrived. A woman. Her name was Emily. She was young. Excited. She had heard about the apartment complex from friends who had once lived there. They said it was quiet. Affordable. The perfect place for someone starting out. But Emily didn't know about the other tenants who had vanished. She didn't know about Susan. Or Carter. Or the horrors buried in the walls. She simply stepped into the building like anyone else. The first few days were fine. Her neighbors were friendly, or at least polite. She had her own space, her own life. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something about the building didn't feel right. At night, she could hear the whispering, faint and muffled, as though it was coming from deep inside the walls. It was almost comforting at first. Like a lullaby. But as the days went on, it became clearer, louder, more insistent. Emily tried to ignore it. She convinced herself it was just the building settling. But the tapping, the breathing, the murmurs, they wouldn't stop. One night, after a long day of work, she sat in the kitchen, her mind drifting as the sound of soft footsteps came from the hallway. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps were light, deliberate,
Slow.
as if someone was walking just outside her door. She rose from the table, her legs shaking, and crept to the door. She slowly reached for the handle. But before she could open it, the door slammed open by itself. The wind rushed in. The air turned icy. And in the doorway, standing there, was a shadow. It wasn't a person. It was something darker. Something inhuman. It was the figure. The same one from the tapes. The one that had haunted Susan. The landlord. The one whose face twisted in the reflection of every room. It moved toward her, its form shifting, flickering like smoke. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice had disappeared.
The figure didn't speak.
It didn't need to. It simply moved closer, filling the doorway, until it loomed over her. Its hollow eyes met hers. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before. Emily couldn't breathe. She was paralyzed. And then she saw it. Behind the figure, in the reflection of the cracked mirror on the far wall, there was another shadow. It was her own, but it wasn't her anymore. It was twisted,
Hollow.
eyes wide, empty. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural, grotesque smile. The walls were alive, and they were calling her. Slowly, she felt the pull, the same pull that had claimed Susan, the same pull that had dragged Carter into the darkness, the same hunger. The walls stretched out, reaching for her. It was too late. The darkness engulfed her, and as Emily's body was pulled into the abyss, she heard a final whisper. Asterisk, you are the next story. Asterisk. The camera blinked on. It had been there the whole time, hidden in the corner, watching, recording everything. The footage was clear. Emily's wide, vacant eyes stared back at the lens. Her face twisted, her mouth moving, but no sound came through. And then, just as the others, she disappeared. The building was silent again. But it wouldn't remain that way. Not for long. The walls, they were always hungry. And the next story was already beginning. The silence in the apartment was deafening, but it didn't last long. The walls, now pulsing with a new energy, seemed to draw breath once again. It was as if the building was waking from a long, hungry slumber. The echoes of Emily's disappearance lingered in the air, a faint memory of her voice lost in the dark. But the darkness didn't stay silent. No, it moved. It always moved. The camera, still recording, blinked once, twice, before its lens slowly adjusted to the stillness. For a moment, it seemed to focus on the empty room. The same cold kitchen where Emily had been standing just moments before. The door was open. The floor was now slick with a strange, dark substance, as if the walls had bled out everything they had taken. And yet the building was still standing, still waiting, still hungry. But the silence was broken. A single sound echoed through the empty hallway. A soft tap, 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 like fingers gently brushing against the walls. The camera recorded it all. In the hallway, the faintest movement, a shadow, growing longer and darker, slipped along the wall, creeping like a sentient thing. It paused near the corner, waiting. The whispering began again, but it was different this time. It was different. The words were clearer, sharper. Asterisk, it's coming. It's already here, asterisk. Another shadow appeared in the doorway, and the camera's lens adjusted, its flickering light catching a glimpse of a figure standing at the threshold.
A man.
A woman. It didn't matter anymore. The figure was no longer human, no longer alive. The walls trembled as the shape moved into the room. A cold breeze followed it, like the first breath of death. For a second, just a second, the shape almost seemed familiar. A face. A flash of Susan's wide, terrified eyes. Carter's twisted expression. But no, it was neither of them. It was someone else. Someone who had already been claimed, someone lost to the building long before. The figure walked through the room, its feet never touching the ground. It hovered, gliding toward the camera with eerie precision, as if it could sense the lens that had been watching all along. It was feeding. And the walls, as if in agreement, shifted. They creaked and groaned, bending inward, tightening their grip on the room. The figure turned toward the camera, its face slowly becoming clear.
Hollow.
Empty. Eyes wide open, but unseeing. The same eyes from the tapes. From the other victims. And then the whisper again, loud and sharp, echoing in the stillness. Asterisk, you can't escape, asterisk. With a flicker, the camera shut off. The room plunged into darkness. The building went still. But it wasn't silent. It never was. The walls were alive, always breathing, always watching. It was hungry again. And the cycle would repeat. For someone else. For anyone else. Because that's how it worked. The apartment complex was never finished. It was a living thing, feeding on the curious, the careless, the ones who dared to enter. And the stories? They never stopped. They were recorded in the walls, in the tapes, in the very foundation of the building. And as the sun set over the city, the hum began again. Another tenant would move in. Another victim would arrive. And the building would wait. Always waiting. Always hungry. The days turned into weeks. The whispers in the building grew louder. But no one heard them. Not yet. The tenants went about their lives, unaware of the dark presence that lingered just beneath the surface. The building, with its cold, creaking walls and hollow rooms, seemed almost normal again. Almost. But there were changes. Subtle ones. The air felt heavier. The shadows in the corners of the rooms grew longer, darker. And at night, when the lights flickered out, the sounds began. The tap-tap-tap of invisible footsteps. The faint, muffled murmur of voices from deep within the walls. The hum of something alive. But no one questioned it. No one dared. Until the new tenant arrived. Her name was Claire. She had no idea what had happened to the others. To Susan. To Carter. To Emily. But Claire wasn't like the others. She was different. She noticed the little things. The odd sounds in the night. The feeling of being watched. She moved into the apartment on the 3rd floor, just 2 doors down from where the last tenant had disappeared. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. The place seemed too quiet. Too perfect. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized something was wrong. Something off. The walls whispered at night. And sometimes, just as she was about to fall asleep, she'd hear a soft scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the floor. At first, Claire dismissed it as the old building settling. But as the days passed, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. Like someone, something, was moving just outside her door. One evening, after a particularly unsettling noise in the hallway, Claire decided to investigate. She opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was dark. Empty. But the air felt thick with something she couldn't quite place. Claire stepped out, glancing down the corridor. There was no one there, but she could hear it. The sound was faint at first. A soft whisper, like a breath in the wind. And then it became clearer. It wasn't a voice. It was a chorus. A low, unearthly hum. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. Claire's feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward it, as if something was pulling her in. She stepped closer. Her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The door creaked open, and inside she saw it. The walls. They were moving. Not in the way walls should. The plaster was shifting, undulating like something alive, something hungry. And at the center of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, its features obscured by the dim light. But Claire could see the faint outline of its face. Hollow eyes. A wide, twisted smile. The landlord. But not the man she remembered from her lease signing. This was something else. Something worse. It was a part of the building now. It had always been a part of it. Before she could react, the figure stepped forward, its form blurring like smoke. And with a sound like a scream trapped in the walls, it lunged at her. The walls screamed back. The sound was deafening. Claire was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing her arm. The cold was unbearable. She tried to pull away, but the walls pressed in on her, trapping her. The room twisted, the shadows closing in. Her vision blurred. And as she was pulled deeper into the darkness, Claire understood. The building didn't just trap its victims. It consumed them. It took their very essence, their stories. And in the end, they became a part of it. Another voice in the chorus. Another face in the reflection. And the walls would always be hungry. The camera, hidden in the corner of the room, flickered back on, recording. It captured the final moments of Claire's existence, the last echoes of her screams swallowed by the dark. And as the camera clicked off, the building settled once more into its uneasy silence.
For now.
But it was never quiet for long. The walls, they were alive. And they were waiting for the next story. The building stood silent again, as it always did after each tragedy. But the silence was never truly empty. There was always a hum beneath it, a low vibration that pulsed through the very foundation of the complex. It was as though the building was savoring the feast of stories it had consumed, each one feeding the darkness within. The walls had grown stronger now, their hunger more insatiable. Claire was just another whisper in the chorus, another shadow beneath the surface. And the building waited. It always waited. Days passed, and the tenants continued to come and go, unaware of the darkness creeping ever closer. The corridors remained eerily quiet, and the building appeared normal to any outsider, perhaps even charming in its worn, old-fashioned way. No one questioned the occasional flicker of lights. No one questioned the sudden, fleeting cold drafts. They all ignored it. But the building didn't ignore them.
No.
It watched. And with every passing day, its hunger grew. And then, on one cold, bleak evening, another tenant moved in. His name was Richard. Richard was a man who had just come out of a difficult breakup. He was looking for something new, something to distract him, something to ease the pain of his past. The building, with its affordable rent and quiet surroundings, seemed like the perfect choice. When he first arrived, Richard thought he noticed the oddness of the place, but shrugged it off. The old apartments often had strange quirks. The floors creaked. The windows rattled in the wind. The lights flickered. It was nothing more than the wear and tear of a building that had been around for decades. But Richard wasn't like the others. He noticed things. The walls seemed to pulse, just a little, as he walked past them. He heard strange noises at night, whispers, scuttling footsteps. He even swore he saw something in the reflection of the hallway mirrors. A shadow. A fleeting figure. Always just out of sight. But Richard was skeptical. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Still, the unease didn't go away. It lingered, like the feeling of being watched. It gnawed at him. Then, one evening, as Richard was returning from work, something strange happened. He entered the building, as usual, greeted by the familiar creak of the old door. But as he stepped into the lobby, something was wrong. The air felt heavy. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than before. The hum of the walls was louder. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty space. He glanced around, but no one was there. Just the stillness of the building. And yet, as he walked toward the stairs, he heard it. A low, eerie whisper coming from the walls. "We are waiting. Waiting for you, asterisk." Richard froze. The voice was soft, but unmistakable. It was like someone was speaking from deep within the building itself. He turned slowly, his heart racing, and looked around the lobby. The place seemed unchanged, yet different. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him. He felt the walls pressing in. His breath quickened. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through water. The whispering grew louder. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was his nerves. But the pull, the weight of it was too much. Richard found himself walking up the stairs, each step a battle against an unseen force. The hallways felt smaller now, more oppressive. The door to his apartment seemed so far away, like it had moved further down the hall. He reached the door and fumbled for his keys. His hand shook. As he stepped inside, the apartment was dark, but the coldness hit him immediately. He switched on the light. Nothing. The air was thick, as if the building itself was holding its breath. And then, a sound. The unmistakable sound of scratching. Slow. Methodical. As if something was clawing at the walls. Richard's pulse quickened. He turned to the sound, but saw nothing. The scratching continued, louder now. He backed away, feeling the walls press in on him. The door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It was in the walls. It was coming from inside. Richard stumbled back toward the window, desperate to escape, But as he looked out, something was wrong. The streetlights outside flickered. The world beyond the glass seemed distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. The building, the city, they didn't look real. They looked shifted, out of place. Richard turned back to the room, and that's when he saw it. A shadow, tall and long, stretching across the floor. The figure was back. The landlord. But not the man he had seen when he first moved in.
No.
This was something far worse. It was a shape now, a creature more than a man, its body twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. Its eyes were hollow, empty, as they fixed on Richard. The voice, now clear and chilling, whispered again. Asterisk, you are here now. You are part of the story. Asterisk. The walls groaned. The shadow grew, its form expanding like smoke, filling the room with darkness. Richard's body froze. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls closed in. The figure moved forward, its shape becoming clearer, more solid. It reached for Richard, and as the darkness swallowed him whole, the camera, hidden once again in the corner of the room, blinked on. The last image it captured was of Richard's terrified face, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then the screen went black. Another story had ended. Another victim claimed. And the building, it waited, always hungry, always listening, for the next one. The darkness stretched on, as if the building had claimed Richard without a trace. The walls hummed, their hunger satisfied for now. But the building was never at peace. It was always restless, always waiting. Outside, the city continued, oblivious to the horror within. People passed by the apartment complex without a second thought. No one suspected what lurked inside. No one felt it. And yet the building knew. It always knew. Time flowed, and soon another tenant arrived. A young couple, freshly in love. They were searching for a home, something quaint, something affordable. The apartment complex seemed perfect, quiet, old, but with character. They never questioned why the price was so low. They never asked why the place felt so empty. At first, they marveled at the creaky floors, the vintage feel of the place. But it didn't take long for things to shift. Little by little, things grew odd. The sounds at night became unbearable. A thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. Then the whispering. It started softly. A faint hum that seemed to come from within the walls, just beneath the surface. They tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the creaks and groans of an old building. But then things started to change. The air in the apartment grew colder. The shadows grew longer. One evening, after an especially long day, they sat down to dinner. The quiet was almost suffocating. But it wasn't just the silence that felt wrong, it was the presence. The feeling of being watched. They turned to each other, unease creeping into their hearts. A soft tap-tap-tap echoed from the hallway outside. The couple exchanged nervous glances. And then, the door to their apartment opened by itself. No wind. No draft. Just the door swinging open slowly, as if it had been waiting for them. Neither of them moved. They couldn't. The air was thick, heavy. The hallway beyond the open door was completely dark. And standing in the shadows, just at the edge of the doorway, was a figure. Its outline was blurry at first, as if it had just stepped out of the darkness. But as the figure stepped forward, it became clearer. The landlord, or at least something that resembled him. His face was hollow, his eyes wide and empty, staring into theirs. And in his hands there was something. A camera. The same camera. The one that had captured the last moments of all the previous tenants. The figure stepped closer, dragging its feet, as if the very air was too thick to move through. A low, chilling whisper filled the air. Asterisk, you are not the first to come here. And you will not be the last, asterisk. The couple didn't scream. They couldn't. The fear had paralyzed them, frozen them in place. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, staring, watching. Then, with a soft click, the camera turned on. The same eerie glow filled the room. It flickered once. Twice. And then it focused on them. The lens was cold, lifeless. It captured their faces, their terror, their confusion. They tried to step back, to run, but the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening force. The sound was like a heartbeat, deep, pounding. The room seemed to close in on them. They backed into the corner, their breath shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. And then, the walls, the walls themselves, began to move. Slowly, with a deep, sickening groan, they shifted, bending and pulsing like something alive. The floor beneath them trembled. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. You shouldn't have come here, the figure said, its voice hollow, distant. You're part of it now, The walls closed in tighter, squeezing them against the corner. The shadows stretched long and black, swallowing the light. Their vision blurred, their breath quickened. They could hear it. The scratching. The soft scraping sound coming from inside the walls, growing louder and louder until it was all they could hear. And then the silence. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers, the scratching, the pulse of the walls. And the camera, still running, captured the last image. The couple's faces, frozen in a state of terror, eyes wide and vacant, their mouths open in silent screams. The camera blinked once.
Twice.
And then, the screen went dark. The building was still. But only for a moment. The hunger wasn't gone. It was waiting. Always waiting. For the next one. For the next story. And the walls, alive with ancient hunger, began to pulse again. The building had grown darker, heavier. The walls, now slick with time and memories, were alive. They were no longer just made of brick and plaster. They had become something else. Something hungry. The echoes of the past were woven into its very bones, each story of terror adding fuel to the fire that burned beneath the surface. And yet, the tenants kept coming. One by one, unaware. Just like the others before them, they stepped into the building with the hopes of finding a place to call home. They had no idea what they were walking into. No idea what was waiting for them in the shadows. But it was always there. Always watching. Always waiting. And now, after so many had vanished without a trace, the building was starving. The new tenant, Jessica was no different. She was young, full of dreams, looking for something simple, affordable, somewhere to begin a new chapter. The apartment she found seemed perfect.
Charming.
Quiet. Affordable. The landlord was odd, sure. But he was friendly. Too friendly, almost. She had noticed the strange flickering of lights in the hallways, the odd, muffled sounds at night, but she brushed it off. The building was old. Everything creaked. The night she moved in, it was late. Jessica was exhausted from hauling boxes and furniture into her new place. She'd left the door unlocked, planning to sort everything out the next day. As she stepped inside, she paused, her eyes scanning the room. The apartment was small, but it had character. There were odd things about it, the way the shadows hung on the walls, a feeling that something was off. But she was too tired to think about it. She closed the door behind her, and that's when she heard it. A soft scratching noise coming from the walls.
Slow. Steady.
She froze. Her heart raced. She couldn't explain it. The noise seemed to be inside the walls. Like something was clawing, scraping at the surface, trying to break free. At first, she told herself it was just the house settling. But then came the whispers.
Low.
Inaudible. Just out of reach. Jessica's eyes darted around the room. Her hands trembled. The shadows in the corners seemed darker now, longer. The light overhead flickered, casting strange shapes against the walls. She walked toward the door to the hallway. It creaked under her feet. She opened it, peering into the dim corridor. Empty. No one was there. But something was. Something that moved. The air was colder now. And then, as if on cue, the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. It was barely visible in the dim light, but the figure was unmistakable. The landlord. But not the man she had seen earlier.
No.
This was different. His form was twisted, distorted. His face was pale, hollow. Empty. The shadows seemed to bend around him. And when he spoke, his voice was not his own. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here, asterisk, he whispered. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like the building itself was speaking. Jessica took a step back. Her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. But she couldn't move. She couldn't scream. And then, the walls groaned. The building itself seemed to shift, to open. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble. With a sound that could only be described as hunger, the walls closed in. The shadows enveloped her, their grip tightening. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut. The landlord moved closer, his body flickering in and out of existence. His hollow eyes locked onto hers. Asterisk, you're already part of it, asterisk, he said. And just like that, the darkness took her. The camera, hidden in the corner, watched it all. It blinked on, capturing Jessica's wide, vacant eyes, her face twisted in an expression of terror. But the screen didn't stay on for long. With a final flicker, it went black. The building was still once more. But it wouldn't remain that way for long. The hunger hadn't been satisfied. The walls would always crave more. The camera, still rolling, would capture the next story. And the building would wait. Always hungry. Always alive. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the apartment complex stood silent once again, cloaked in darkness. The building had swallowed yet another story, another life. The walls, slick with the residue of the past, creaked and whispered as if satisfied, their hunger momentarily sated. But the emptiness that followed was an illusion. The building was never truly at rest. The walls, thick with memories, continued to breathe, shifting and groaning in the dead of night. They were alive, pulsing with an energy far older than any of its tenants could comprehend. But the world outside? The world continued on as it always had, unaware of the growing malignancy beneath its feet. People passed by, cars drove by, the hum of city life persisted, but within the building, time seemed to stop. Time didn't matter here. Yet, as every story ended, whether violently, tragically, or quietly, the building only grew more insatiable. The hunger, the waiting, the insidious pull of the walls, they never stopped. They waited for the next soul to cross the threshold. The next victim to come to the door, just like Susan, Carter, Emily, Claire, and Richard. And now, Jessica. The camera, still rolling, recorded it all. As the lens focused on the empty hallway, now eerily quiet, the faint sound of scratching, soft at first, began again. The whispers in the walls returned, quiet but persistent, as if the building itself were anticipating its next feast. No one knew what happened to those who had disappeared into the dark corners of that place. The few who had survived, if any, never spoke of it. They left. They fled without a word, too terrified to look back. The building, however, did not forget them. It held them within its walls, their stories ingrained in the very structure. The stories never truly ended. They were simply swallowed, absorbed, fed to the insatiable hunger that lived within the apartment complex. And as the camera flickered off, the building exhaled, its dark presence expanding. The next story, the next victim, was already beginning. Because the hunger would never end. And the building would never stop waiting for the next one.